The woman stared at her ceiling fan for the fifth consecutive night, watching shadows dance across her bedroom walls. Sleep, once her faithful companion, had become an elusive stranger. Her career was in shambles despite her qualifications, her relationships fractured without explanation, and a persistent heaviness shadowed her every move. Medical tests revealed nothing. Therapists offered temporary relief, but the crushing weight remained. What she didn't realize, what many don't, is that these seemingly disconnected symptoms might indicate something far more insidious: a spiritual attack. The reality of spiritual attacks represents one of the most misunderstood and deliberately avoided topics in modern spiritual discourse. While physical ailments receive immediate attention and psychological struggles have gained deserved recognition, the spiritual dimension of human suffering remains shrouded in uncomfortable silence. This silence doesn't eliminate the threat. It merely leaves people vulnerable and uninformed about forces that may be actively working against their well-being. What makes spiritual attacks particularly dangerous is their ability to masquerade as ordinary misfortune. A series of persistent bad luck incidents, unexplainable health issues that confound medical professionals, or sudden behavioral changes might actually be manifestations of negative spiritual interference. The subtlety with which these attacks operate often means people suffer silently for years, attributing their struggles to bad luck or personal shortcomings rather than recognizing the spiritual warfare being waged against them. The Islamic tradition has long recognized the reality of these unseen influences. The Quran and Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad contain numerous references to protection from negative spiritual forces, demonstrating that spiritual defense has been a concern for humanity throughout history. What's troubling is not that these attacks exist, but that modern society has largely abandoned the protective spiritual practices that once safeguarded communities. Recognizing the shadows, common signs of spiritual attacks. Spiritual attacks often manifest through patterns rather than isolated incidents. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward reclaiming spiritual sovereignty. One of the most common signs is persistent sleep disturbances, not occasional insomnia, but a prolonged inability to rest properly despite physical exhaustion. Many experiencing spiritual attacks report waking consistently between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m., traditionally recognized as times when negative spiritual energies are most active. Another telltale sign is the presence of recurring nightmares with similar themes or figures. These aren't random dreams, but can be attempts by negative entities to create fear and drain vital energy. Often, those experiencing these dreams wake feeling more exhausted than before sleeping, as if their rest provided no actual recovery. Persistent misfortunes that defy logical explanation represent another warning sign. When opportunities consistently fall through at the last moment, relationships sour without apparent cause, or financial stability remains elusive despite sound decisions, spiritual interference may be at play. The hallmark of these situations is their pattern, not isolated bad luck, but consistent, almost orchestrated setbacks that seem to target specific areas of life. Physical symptoms with no medical explanation frequently accompany spiritual attacks. Chronic fatigue, unexplained pains that move throughout the body, sudden temperature changes in specific areas, or feeling physically drained after spending time in certain locations or with certain people can all indicate negative spiritual influences. Many people describe feeling a heaviness on their chest or shoulders, or pressure on their head that comes and goes without apparent cause. Perhaps most disturbing is the emotional and psychological impact. Those under spiritual attack often experience sudden, intense emotional shifts that feel foreign to their usual temperament. Overwhelming feelings of despair, uncharacteristic anger, paranoia, or thoughts of self-harm that seem to arrive fully formed rather than develop gradually may indicate external spiritual influence rather than internal psychological processes. The silent suffering. Why these attacks go unaddressed. The reality of spiritual attacks remains largely unacknowledged for several compelling reasons. In modern societies dominated by materialistic worldviews, discussions about unseen forces are often dismissed as superstition or psychological projection. This cultural dismissal creates a profound silence around spiritual attacks, leaving those experiencing them feeling isolated and questioning their own sanity. Even within religious communities where the existence of spiritual entities is acknowledged, there's often reluctance to address attacks directly. This hesitation stems partly from fear of attracting negative attention and partly from the specialization required to properly address such matters. The result is a gap in spiritual care precisely when people need it most. Another barrier to addressing spiritual attacks is their ability to mimic other conditions. When someone experiences persistent misfortune, the default explanation tends towards psychological issues, bad luck, or random chance. Few professionals in any field, medical, psychological, or even religious, are trained to recognize the patterns that distinguish spiritual attacks from other causes of suffering. This diagnostic void means many people receive treatments that address symptoms while the root cause remains untouched. Perhaps most concerning is how spiritual attacks often target those actively pursuing spiritual growth or positive life changes. This targeting isn't random. Entities that benefit from human suffering often direct their attention toward those posing the greatest threat to their influence. As someone begins elevating their consciousness, strengthening their faith, or moving toward positive transformation, the intensity of spiritual opposition often increases proportionally. Without proper protection, this opposition can derail even the most dedicated spiritual aspirant. The escalation pattern. Why ignoring spiritual attacks proves dangerous. Spiritual attacks rarely maintain a consistent intensity. Instead, they follow a pattern of escalation when left unaddressed. What begins as subtle interference, minor disruptions, occasional bad luck, fleeting negative thoughts, gradually intensifies into more direct and damaging manifestations. This progression isn't accidental but strategic, designed to gradually erode resistance and spiritual immunity. The initial phase of spiritual attacks often targets energy and vitality. Persistent fatigue, despite adequate rest and nutrition, serves to weaken overall resilience. This fatigue isn't merely physical, but extends to emotional and mental capacities as well. Decision-making becomes more difficult, emotional regulation suffers, and the spiritual practices that might offer protection feel increasingly burdensome. Many people abandon protective spiritual practices precisely when they need them most, creating a dangerous vulnerability. As attacks progress, relationships often become casualties. Misunderstandings multiply, communication breaks down, and once solid connections begin to fracture. This isolation isn't coincidental but serves to separate the person from potential sources of support and protection. The wisdom of Islamic tradition has long recognized this danger, emphasizing the importance of community and shared spiritual practice as forms of protection. Financial stability frequently comes under assault during spiritual attacks. Unexpected expenses arise, promising opportunities collapse at the final moment, and resources seem to drain away through countless small leaks rather than obvious catastrophes. This financial pressure creates practical stress that further compromises spiritual and emotional resilience, creating a downward spiral that's difficult to escape without intervention. Perhaps most alarming is the final phase of untreated spiritual attacks, where physical health begins to deteriorate in ways that confound medical professionals. Symptoms appear and disappear without apparent cause, standard treatments prove ineffective, and the overall trajectory is one of decline rather than recovery. This phase represents the most direct danger of ignoring spiritual attacks, as they ultimately manifest in the physical realm with sometimes devastating consequences. The protection paradox. Common misconceptions. The field of spiritual protection suffers from widespread misconceptions that leave many vulnerable despite their best intentions. One of the most pervasive misunderstandings involves mass-produced protective items sold without customization or proper spiritual preparation. These items, often marketed as universal protection, rarely provide genuine safeguarding and may actually attract negative attention through their inauthentic nature. Another dangerous misconception involves the source of spiritual protection. True protection doesn't come from objects themselves, but from the divine power they channel when properly prepared. In Islamic tradition, the power of Quranic verses serves as the foundation for protection, but this power must be properly accessed and directed by those with genuine spiritual knowledge and authorization. The Quran itself emphasizes this principle in numerous verses, highlighting that protection comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with physical items serving only as conduits for this divine protection. Many people mistakenly believe that any spiritual practitioner can provide effective protection. This misconception ignores the crucial importance of lineage, training, and spiritual authorization. Authentic spiritual protection requires practitioners who have undergone rigorous preparation, received proper authorization through established spiritual chains, and maintained the pure intention and lifestyle necessary to access divine protective powers. Without these qualifications, attempts at protection may prove ineffective or even counterproductive. Perhaps the most dangerous misconception involves the belief that spiritual protection represents a one-time solution rather than an ongoing practice. Genuine protection requires maintenance, renewal, and adaptation as circumstances change. This understanding mirrors the Islamic concept of maintaining a constant state of remembrance and awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing that spiritual vigilance must become a lifestyle rather than an occasional response to obvious threats. Quranic talismans. Ancient wisdom for modern protection. Among the most powerful forms of spiritual protection within the Islamic tradition are custom-crafted Quranic talismans, also known as ta'is. These protective devices have a distinguished history dating back to the earliest days of Islam, with numerous accounts of the Prophet Muhammad's companions utilizing Quranic verses for protection from negative spiritual influences. This practice doesn't represent superstition, but rather the practical application of divine guidance in addressing unseen challenges. The effectiveness of authentic Quranic talismans stems from several key factors that distinguish them from mass-produced alternatives. First and foremost is the content. Genuine talismans contain carefully selected Quranic verses chosen specifically to address the particular challenges facing the individual. This customization is crucial, as different spiritual attacks require different forms of divine protection. The one-size-fits-all approach common in commercial talismans fundamentally misunderstands how spiritual protection operates. Beyond appropriate verse selection, the preparation process plays a vital role in a talisman's effectiveness. Authentic talismans are handwritten with specific intentions and under particular spiritual conditions. The spiritual practitioner must maintain a state of ritual purity, observe specific prayers and fasting practices, and work during auspicious times that enhance the flow of divine energy. These preparations aren't mere formalities but essential elements that determine whether the talisman will serve as an effective channel for divine protection. The materials used in crafting a talisman also contribute significantly to its protective capacity. Traditional practices call for natural materials that readily conduct spiritual energy, specific papers, inks derived from natural sources, and containers made from materials with inherent protective qualities. These materials are often treated with blessed oils and herbs that enhance the receptivity to divine energy and create layers of complementary protection. Perhaps most important is the spiritual authorization of the practitioner creating the talisman. Effective protection requires more than technical knowledge. It demands spiritual permission granted through established chains of transmission. These chains, known as ijaza in Islamic tradition, ensure that the practitioner has received proper training, demonstrated moral qualification, and obtained permission to access the spiritual energies necessary for effective protection. Without this authorization, even technically correct talismans may lack the spiritual potency required for genuine protection. The process, how authentic Quranic talismans work. Understanding the mechanics of spiritual protection helps clarify why authentic Quranic talismans prove effective, while improvised alternatives often fail. At the foundational level, these talismans work by establishing a field of divine energy around the individual that repels negative spiritual influences. This field doesn't eliminate free will or natural consequences, but provides a barrier against unwarranted spiritual interference. The process begins with careful assessment of the individual's specific situation. This assessment considers not just obvious symptoms, but subtle patterns that reveal the nature and source of spiritual attacks. An experienced practitioner recognizes distinctive signatures in how attacks manifest. Certain entities leave recognizable patterns in their influence. This diagnostic precision allows for the selection of precisely targeted Quranic verses known to be particularly effective against specific types of negative influence. The creation process involves more than simply writing verses. Authentic practitioners perform specific prayers and spiritual practices while crafting the talisman, essentially charging it with divine energy through established spiritual protocols. Many practitioners observe specific fasting regimens and additional prayers during the creation period, creating optimal conditions for divine blessing to infuse the physical materials. Once created, the talisman establishes what might be described as a resonant field of divine energy that remains connected to its source. This isn't static protection, but an active, responsive field that adapts to emerging threats. The Quranic verses continue vibrating at a spiritual level, creating an environment inhospitable to negative entities. Those experiencing this protection often report feeling a lightness or clarity that had been absent during the period of spiritual attack. Proper maintenance enhances the talisman's effectiveness over time. This includes observing specific rules about handling the talisman, regular prayers that reinforce its connection to divine sources, and periodic renewal procedures that refresh its protective capacity. This maintenance reflects the Islamic understanding that spiritual protection represents an ongoing relationship with divine sources rather than a one-time intervention. Finding authentic protection in a world of imitations. The surge in spiritual awareness has unfortunately led to a proliferation of inauthentic protective items that promise much but deliver little. Discerning authentic protection from ineffective imitations requires understanding several crucial distinctions. Perhaps most important is the customization factor. Authentic protection is always tailored to the individual's specific situation rather than mass-produced with generic claims. Genuine practitioners prioritize understanding before intervention. They ask detailed questions about symptoms, patterns, and circumstances rather than immediately prescribing solutions. This diagnostic phase allows for precise tailoring of protection and reveals the practitioner's depth of knowledge. Those offering instant solutions without thorough assessment often lack the spiritual discernment necessary for effective protection. The creation timeframe provides another important indicator of authenticity. Genuine protective talismans require time to properly prepare, typically days rather than hours. This time accommodates the necessary prayers, spiritual preparations, and careful crafting that infuse the talisman with protective power. Instant solutions contradict the established spiritual principles governing authentic protection. Transparent explanation of processes and limitations distinguishes authentic practitioners from questionable alternatives. Genuine spiritual protection comes with clearly explained protocols, specific rules for maintaining effectiveness, and honest acknowledgement of what the protection can and cannot accomplish. This transparency stems from the Islamic emphasis on truthfulness and clear guidance rather than mystification. The most reliable indicator of authenticity may be the practitioner's spiritual lineage and training. Effective protection requires authorization through established chains of transmission that verify proper training and spiritual permission. Without this authorization, practitioners lack access to the spiritual energies necessary for genuine protection, regardless of their technical knowledge or sincere intentions. Taking action. Addressing spiritual attacks effectively. Confronting spiritual attacks requires a balanced approach that acknowledges their reality without surrendering to fear. The first step involves honest assessment, recognizing patterns that suggest spiritual interference rather than dismissing them as coincidence or bad luck. This recognition doesn't mean attributing every misfortune to a spiritual attack, but developing discernment about distinctive patterns that indicate external interference. Immediate protective measures can help stabilize the situation while seeking more comprehensive solutions. Regular recitation of protective Quranic verses, particularly Ayatul Kursi, 2 to 255, the last two verses of Surah al-Baqarah, 2 to 285-286, and the four calls, Surahs al-Ikhlas, al-Falaq, and Nas, and al-Kafirun, provides a foundation of protection accessible to anyone, regardless of spiritual specialization. These verses have been specifically identified in Islamic tradition as having powerful protective qualities. Creating an environment inhospitable to negative influences represents another important step. This includes maintaining physical cleanliness, regularly purifying spaces with practices like burning specific incense or reciting the Quran in all areas of the home, and being mindful about the energy of people allowed into personal spaces. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized the importance of both physical and spiritual cleanliness as complementary aspects of holistic protection. For persistent or severe attacks, seeking specialized assistance becomes necessary. This assistance should come from practitioners with verified credentials and established spiritual lineage. Authentic Quranic talismans, created by qualified practitioners with proper spiritual authorization, provide specialized protection tailored to the specific nature of the attack. These talismans work by establishing a field of divine protection that repels negative influences while strengthening the individual's spiritual immunity. The most comprehensive approach combines external protection with internal spiritual development. Regular prayer, Quranic recitation, and maintenance of moral conduct strengthen spiritual resilience and create natural immunity to many forms of attack. This balanced approach acknowledges both the reality of external spiritual threats and the importance of internal spiritual cultivation as complementary aspects of complete protection. The path forward. Reclaiming your spiritual sovereignty. Breaking free from spiritual attacks ultimately requires reclaiming personal spiritual sovereignty, the inherent right to exist free from unwarranted spiritual interference. This reclamation isn't achieved through fear or paranoia, but through informed, decisive action grounded in authentic spiritual tradition. The Islamic approach to spiritual protection emphasizes empowerment through knowledge rather than helplessness through ignorance. Custom-crafted Quranic talismans represent one of the most powerful tools for reclaiming spiritual sovereignty. These talismans, when created by qualified practitioners, establish a field of divine protection specifically calibrated to the individual's situation. Unlike mass-produced alternatives, authentic talismans address the specific nature and source of spiritual attacks rather than offering generic protection. The process of obtaining such protection begins with reaching out to qualified practitioners who maintain the necessary spiritual lineage and authorization. This outreach should include a detailed description of symptoms and patterns, as this information allows for precise customization of protection. Providing one's full name and mother's name, along with a recent photograph, enables the practitioner to establish the spiritual connection necessary for effective protection. Proper implementation of protective measures requires following specific guidelines for handling and maintaining talismans. These guidelines aren't arbitrary restrictions, but essential protocols that preserve the talisman's protective capacity. Observing these protocols, keeping the talisman from impure locations, avoiding contact with prohibited substances, and maintaining personal purity while carrying it ensures continued effectiveness. The ultimate goal extends beyond merely repelling current attacks to establishing lasting spiritual immunity. This immunity develops through the combination of external protection and internal spiritual development, regular prayer, Quranic recitation, moral conduct, and conscious cultivation of positive spiritual states. The Islamic tradition emphasizes this comprehensive approach, recognizing that true protection comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with talismans serving as conduits rather than sources of divine protection. Conclusion: breaking the silence, embracing protection. The reality of spiritual attacks represents one of the most consistently overlooked dimensions of human suffering. This oversight doesn't reflect the absence of such attacks, but rather a collective reluctance to acknowledge unseen influences that contradict materialistic worldviews. Breaking this silence requires courage, the willingness to consider explanations that extend beyond conventional frameworks when persistent patterns suggest spiritual interference. Recognizing the possibility of spiritual attacks doesn't mean surrendering to fear or attributing every misfortune to malevolent entities. Instead, it means developing discernment about distinctive patterns that indicate external interference rather than random chance. This discernment represents the first step toward effective protection and restored well-being. Authentic Quranic talismans, crafted by qualified practitioners with proper spiritual authorization, provide specialized protection against spiritual attacks. These talismans work by establishing a field of divine protection calibrated to the individual's specific situation. Unlike mass-produced alternatives, genuine talismans address the particular nature and source of spiritual attacks rather than offering generic protection that rarely proves effective. For those experiencing persistent misfortune, unexplained health issues, relationship disruptions, or other patterns suggesting spiritual interference, taking action is essential. This action begins with reaching out to qualified practitioners who maintain the necessary spiritual lineage and authorization. By providing detailed information about symptoms and patterns, individuals enable precise customization of protection specifically tailored to their situation. True protection ultimately comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with talismans serving as conduits rather than sources of divine protection. This understanding aligns with the Islamic emphasis on divine sovereignty while acknowledging the role of authorized spiritual practitioners in facilitating access to divine protection. Through this balanced approach, combining authentic protective measures with personal spiritual development, individuals can reclaim their spiritual sovereignty and live free from unwarranted interference. If you're experiencing symptoms of spiritual attack, don't suffer in silence. Reach out via email at support@ruhanianlinespiritualhelp.co or WhatsApp at +447,734,408,262 to discuss your situation and explore authentic protective options. Custom-made Quranic talismans, created by qualified practitioners with proper spiritual authorization, can help restore balance and protection to your life.